Is The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time one of the greatest games of all time?
Welcome to the inaugural and perhaps only ever episode of the Greatest Games of All Time podcast. I am Aaron. I'm here with my co-host Brandon. And on this podcast, what we're trying to do is determine for you, the listener, whether a game deserves
Mispronunciation incoming.
fucking god, whether a game deserves to have the epithet one of the greatest games of all time written on its Wikipedia page. And the game that we've chosen for this first episode is The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And that's a big one. And what we're going to do on this podcast is we've each played through the game, and we're going to pick five. We each picked 5 topics as we were playing through, just that we thought were relevant to sort of understanding the game and its historical context and how it plays now. And that's just going to kind of be the format. We'll sort of ping pong back and forth, talk about each one for 5 or 6 minutes maybe, and then we'll move on to the next one. And then at the end, we'll maybe have a wrap-up session where we talk about, do we think it's one of the greatest games of all time? So having said that, Brandon, do you want to go first, or I can jump in first?
Why don't you kick us off? Because I think you have a little bit of a lead on prep, and then I think I'll be able to get some inertia from that.
Right on. Okay. So what I wanted to do first, and what I think is really important to do, is kind of place this in the greater continuity of Zelda's development, Ocarina of Time. And I think it's super interesting to look at just who worked on the game. And if you look at the staff role for Link to the Past and compare it with Ocarina of Time, there's really almost no sort of change or sort of continuity between those two development staffs. Miyamoto's obviously the sort of helmed the project in both cases, but the director on Link to the Past and also Super Mario Brothers 3 and Super Mario World and every game you've ever loved basically was Takashi Tezuka. And on Ocarina of Time, he's only listed as a supervisor. And when I play the game, I don't get the sense that he did that much supervising, to be honest. And the reason I say that is because when I think about a classic Tezuka game like Link to the Past, the soul of his sort of games and his game design, I think, lives in that space where you're encountering an enemy and there's not a specific right way to defeat that enemy, if that makes sense. It's like, in Link to the Past, Link is canonically left-handed, right? And he swings his sword in a way that's not a perfect half moon shape in front of his body. It's sort of concentrated on the left. Yeah. As you'll remember, I'm sure. And so you might have a situation where an enemy is like approaching you from the right on a diagonal, but you can only swing your sword on the left, and you can only face in the 4 cardinal directions, and you sort of have to make that split-second decision of like, okay, do I sort of retreat and try to reposition so that I'm positioned right to hit the enemy, or do I try to turn quickly and hit the enemy? And that's sort of like gray zone that you're constantly in. I think you see that in Super Mario World, Super Mario Brothers 3. And I think that's really absent in Ocarina of Time. And that's not necessarily a good or bad thing. But I think if I think about like a quintessential Ocarina of Time encounter, it's the Wolfos enemy. And there is an objectively right way to defeat a Wolfos, I think. And that is the Wolfos will swing at you once, and if it misses, it swings again, and it misses again, and the force of the second swing like rotates its body all the way around so that its back is exposed to you, and then you just hit B once and it dies. And that's sort of the best way to fight the Wolfos enemy. And I find that I think a lot of that Tezuka design ends up it's just not really in Ocarina of Time. And again, that's not necessarily good or bad, but it makes for a much different enemy encounter in Ocarina of Time than it would be in Link to the Past, for example.
That's really interesting. So, first of all, you're blowing my mind with the Link to the Past left-handed. Like, as you're saying all of that, I can perfectly picture everything that you mentioned there, and I even have like the muscle memory of the interaction there, of how to behave in those situations. I never. Anyway, that's crazy, and I'm kind of what I'm thinking about though is like he has a lot of expertise or familiarity in the 2D realm and kind of operating or creating those gray area moments that feel right. And I wonder if translating to 3D, maybe some of his like I'm just wondering, speculating, like if he was absent because he didn't have something to add there. There wasn't his expertise didn't translate. It doesn't translate to 3D well. Because one of the things this is similar to one of the things I was thinking about or talking about is like the combat, the mechanics of combat in this game, and how on one hand they're in a new realm, it's 3D.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much to talk about, like how much credit to give to that this was also the first time in 3D that Zelda had been done. So I don't know if that's a metric when you're talking about greatest game of all time. Like, does that matter?
Yeah, I think we have to separate. It's like I think Ocarina of Time can be extremely impressive for what it managed to achieve for being the first sort of like 3D action adventure game, but then separate that from the question of, okay, to play it in like a modern context, does it count as a greatest game of all time?
Right, totally. And so then going back to the combat, then you talk about like there are specific dynamics of interaction, like you're saying, like with the Wolfos, but largely the combat mechanics are pretty simple, right? It doesn't have the kind of nuance that you might expect from coming from something like Link to the Past, like you're calling out, where there are things things to do in terms of timing or parrying and this kind of thing, but there's still something lacking there that I felt, where it didn't feel as full as I would want out of the everything that Link is supposed to be as a warrior.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what's conspicuous to me in those encounters is like two enemies never attack you at the same time.
Right.
Pretty
right.
much like the other ones just like sort of wait. And post Dark Souls, I mean, that's sort of a big one for me, but you might have played some other ones, other sort of 3D action adventure games where it's just sort of commonplace now that multiple enemies are going to attack you, and that's sort of where a lot of the challenge starts to come in, is how to manage multiple enemies simultaneously. But I think they might have felt like, first time in 3D, a lot of people are just going to be sort of like scared shitless by that maybe, or they feel like they won't have anything to anchor onto, or just feel kind of adrift. And so
totally.
And so maybe they made that decision to only have one attack you at once.
It does feel very intentional, and for that reason, where it's like, hey, we're putting you in a whole new realm. We want you to feel proficient at it, and so you could have like multiple enemies around, but yeah, they're not attacking, and I think that was actually a good design choice. Like that's the correct way to go, but it does give you kind of a hollow feeling. Yeah, where there's just you're kind of like, okay, I attack you, I jump around, and then next in line, like take a number. So it's not the kind of combat that, again, that we've gotten used to, I guess.
Yeah, it doesn't feel satisfying now, I think. And I think it sort of hints at how, I mean, the first time you're playing that game, you're not really noticing that. I think if you're playing it as like a 13-year-old in 1999, you're not really noticing that the Stalfos is just the second Stalfos is just like hanging back, waiting for the first one to die so it can jump in, because you're just sort of blown away by the technology and the feeling of being in 3D for the first time. But again, in a modern context, I think it ends up feeling kind of hollow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think we covered that. Do you want to jump in with your first topic?
So I mean, that was kind of so. My first topic was around mechanics, in terms of like input and just like the input engine. So combat being part of that, I guess we've covered just the simplicity there, which I'm willing to like I said, give credit for. Like I think there's intentional design there. I don't think it was bad design. But it was simplistic, and I think part of that is this is the first time doing it, so really how complex could it be? But then also part of it is let's not overwhelm these people, right? I mean, the N64 has what, like six face buttons, and then all of the,
Yeah.
it had the two triggers and the Z. So there was plenty to work with in terms of potential like input modality.
Yeah.
So I on that regard, as far as combat, I think they did pretty well. And in terms of movement, like I don't actually know. So as you're saying this with Tezuka, like a lot of those games that you mentioned, they feel very tight. Like the controls feel very tight. Like you always feel very connected to the player. Was he on Mario 64? Was he involved there, or do you know?
I think he was an assistant director on that, like working directly under Miyamoto. But he was, I mean, he was like more than capable of directing his own game.
Right.
And I wonder if they just decided, like, because I think something like 120 people was the final tally that worked on Ocarina of Time. And that was probably, 5 or 6 times the size of the team on Link to the Past. So with the development teams growing, maybe they felt like they needed to spread that guy around.
Right.
And just sort of like have his knowledge dropped on a lot of different games versus just focusing on one or two.
Yeah. I'd be interested to I think that's a great point you're bringing. So I'd be interested to know more about like how that affected the shape of things. But in terms of even with the combat, what it was, like it felt very tight in terms of your ability to move around, right? Like I know you can lock on and the parrying, backflips and all of that. Like once you get what you're supposed to do, you can be pretty proficient in combat. And again, it is simple and it's one-on-one. But I rarely felt myself just kind of flailing at somebody. And so I think that's a testament to like their to good design there on input. I also again, this is something that I don't know how much to give extra credit for, but because it was one of the first 3D experiences, but the lock-on system I thought was really well done. There was some weird, kind of funkiness to it with, some things you would hover, like Navi would turn green, and that was just like a hover item, not something you could lock on. Versus others are yellow and you can lock on. And I appreciate what they were going for, but it just wasn't always clear. Like, I don't know that I liked that distinction. But not to focus, that's more of interaction than input. But the input of like locking onto things and movement, mostly I thought felt really good. Everything felt really responsive. I think something that can happen in modern games is they get so hung up in their animation, like the playthrough of the animation, that you start feeling loose, or you start feeling disconnected from the character, or frustrated that like I'm trying to interact and I can't.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel that, much, or if at all, that I can think of.
Yeah, it's almost like I want to say that because they did do a good job of they make it clear what you're supposed to do when, right? Like it's the Wolfos, and the Wolfos turning its back to you, and then I hit B, and the result of that is that I think once you grasp all of those signs that the game basically shows you a sign, and it's like, hey, dummy, remember to do this when I show you this sign. And once you internalize all those, it's super fluid, and I think that comes more with beating the game like 5 or 6 times, like I've probably done in my life. And so when I play it now, it almost plays like just like an interactive movie or something like that, because I know what to do on every point. And it's interesting to play it with my son, who's 4, and I know your son's a similar age.
Yeah.
and he loves. I mean, he's told me like Ocarina of Time is my favorite game,
Hmm.
even though he just sits there and watches it. But I just always know what to do. You know, I know what every sign from every enemy means. I know what every, hook shot target means I'm supposed to do. And so it's super fluid, just like flowing through the game.
Yeah.
Um, and that's probably the best case outcome for Ocarina of Time, right? Once you internalize all those signs and you're just sort of like flying through the game, everything's smooth. You know what to do. I think I wanted to talk about this later, but like in future Zelda games where I have played them less and I know less and less of what to do, I just find that frustrating.
Right.
Like trying to figure out what does this fucking sign mean that the game keeps showing me that I'm supposed to do, and I don't get it and I feel dumb. But with Ocarina of Time, I think the best case scenario is you just kind of get it and you're just skating through.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that does come with the familiarity of past experiences, because when I do think about the more modern games and they start getting, modern games in general are trying to get away from like HUD elements, and especially when I played Breath of the Wild, I played it with, they call it what, advanced or pro mode, like with no
Me
HUD,
too.
because it's gorgeous, right? And I don't want stuff on the screen,
Yeah.
and you don't want little floating reticles and all of that. Um, or I lost where I was going with this, but basically it's just in Ocarina of Time, those items are there, um, but I wouldn't necessarily ding them for that, right? I mean, you're in a new realm, and so how do I focus your attention to these things that you haven't seen before? But I wonder if that was too much handholding. Did they need to do that? Like, do we need to paint the things red, or do we need to um,
Yeah.
do the targeting? I ultimately I like the targeting, but yeah, that's a curious a point there. Like, how necessary was it?
Yeah. I think we'd probably agree that it was super necessary at the time, right? It's
Yeah.
like because I'm sure they felt like, we don't even know what we're doing making this game in 3D. We're figuring it all out as we go along. And to this day, there are people whose brains just can't grok 3D. I've heard about cases, where people, like especially adults who don't play games and
Right.
moving around in 3 dimensions, they just can't get it, and I'm sure that that was a significant fear for them. I think, but then it's like, it's like that question we were talking about earlier. How much do we applaud them for solving the technical challenge of the time, which is making a 3D action adventure game? And can we separate that from the question of, okay, to play it in a modern context now, is it fun? Is it rewarding? Is it satisfying? And to me, it's it ends up not being as satisfying when I feel like the game is hitting me over the head with, you're supposed to do this now, you're supposed to do this now.
Yeah.
To me, the most egregious example is like when they highlight the text, like even in text,
Yes.
they highlight text that like show it in red. It's like, hey, pay attention to these specific words because this is a hint that we're giving you, dummy.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
No. And no, that's a great point, because I think back to Link to the Past, um, and I remember, and I played it as a young kid, but I missed a lot of stuff because you have to read and you have to, who do I talk to? Where do I
yeah,
go? Kind of thing. Um, but I actually don't remember in Link to the Past if they did that highlighting like that. I
I
don't
don't
think
think
they
they
did.
do. No.
Right. And so, because I feel like that would have, stuck out to me. And so, yeah, if they're designing that for kids, that's a great thing to add. But if you're designing it as again, like you're saying, like there's two paths here, right? Did they design it well for their audience and for the time? Absolutely. Um, e- Evaluating it across time, no,
Mm.
that doesn't hold up. Like where you look at something like a 2D game, it gets the benefit, or it can get the benefit of having like that stylization, that it doesn't get dinged for graphics and interaction. It becomes a style.
Mhm.
Uh, Highlighting the text, that's not a style. That's I mean, it is, but it's just like, it's fucking annoying. It's like, yeah, I got it. Okay, red, red items, and the blue items and whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. So beating the player over the head is not necessarily uh, the right way to go. But So
Yeah.
I'm willing to recognize it, but yeah, I won't give concessions given the context of what we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's the right approach too. Um, I wanted to talk about like hook shot targets and eye switches that you shoot with a bow and other such tropes in Zelda. And I think when I was trying to sort of prepare for this, I was going back and looking at interviews and with the developers who worked on the game, and it was interesting to me to find that from sort of the even earliest stages of development, there was a whole team, Miyamoto says, whose job it was basically just to figure out how some of the classical Zelda items like the bow and the hookshot would work in 3D
Right.
space. And it is hard for me not to see now, if I sort of zoom out to like a macro level, that the game is if you're very uncharitably sort of assessing it, it's hard for me not to see the game as just sort of like a linear chain of those instances of like hookshot target, red ice that you put the blue fire on, bow or like eye switch that you shoot with the bow, and there are many other such examples. And I think it's the same thing as like, hey dummy, hit the Wolfos now. Like
Right.
it's
Yeah, here's your
obviously
time
at
to
its
push a button. Yeah.
yeah. And uh, again, that's probably a concession to the time period where it. I mean, just from the perspective of being a developer on that game, it's like, how do I make this work in 3D? A hookshot target at least is going to let us put the hook shot in the game. I think because that happened so early on in development, they probably felt like, okay, well, we sort of figured these out, these little micro interactions. We need to put them in the game now. And so they stayed in the game, but it doesn't make it any less, I don't want to say like insulting, but unsatisfying now to see a hook shot target, like this stupid thing that someone just put on the wall, and it's like, oh, I guess I shoot my hook shot into this arbitrary thing that happens to be on the wall. It doesn't make it any less unsatisfying to play it in a modern context. Again, I'm not saying it wasn't a necessity to put that in at the time, but in a modern context, it feels kind of hollow, I think.
Right, where now, like, yeah, exactly. Nowadays, you'd have something that's more with the design aesthetic of the dungeon or of the area you're in, and you just know based on the material, like, oh, I can hook shot into wood, and so here's a wooden door frame, or whatever it is. I think you can see other emergent kind of design choices, right, with the scarecrow, which it's like, again, first playthrough, I didn't think anything of that. Here's a thing that I can, hook shot to. But when you kind of zoom out and you look at the game overall, you can see how they probably worked themselves into a place where it's like, okay, we have these hook shot things. Okay, now we have a design and we don't know how to get you from here to here. Oh, let's just make a wooden thing that you can conjure and grapple to, right? And it's exactly what you're saying about they have a linear path they want you to follow. And then when the design of the world got in the way, they just put a shortcut in. And it's like, oh, here's a mechanic where you create a piece of wood when we need to. And it's even more egregious than the hookshot panel on the wall because it's not even a part of the world. It's something that comes out of the ground and is kind of, even the design of Scarecrow, it's like, what, maybe that has a meaning, but like, what is this? Like, what are you putting in here? Like, it kind of, that's interesting.
Again, I think at the time, like you said, you don't think anything of it, but in a modern context, it's so clear. You could just see like the gears in the developer's mind turning almost, it's like, okay, we got to figure this out so we can have this thing pop up out of the ground. One of many examples where they were solving a technical problem, and at the time, it was masked by, that process, that the fact that the developer is specifically doing that, you don't really notice it because just sort of the technical wizardry of the game obscures it. But, post Breath of the Wild, to go back and play something like that, it's like, oh, come on, dude.
Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. I will come back to that with Breath of the Wild, but yeah, post Breath of the Wild, pretty much everything is ruined, I think. But,
yeah.
I think what you have though right there with like the hook shot and the eye bow and arrow pieces like perfectly summarizes that struggle of translation. You know, where it's like they did it, but it might not have been the best that it could have been. Or
Yeah, I mean, I think, maybe they felt like, again, this is going to be such a challenge to do something in 3D. I mean, they'd already made Super Mario 64, right? But it's different to make a Zelda style game than it is a Mario style game. So they're essentially starting from scratch, and it's natural, I think, to look at what you did before and think, okay, well, let's translate what we did before into 3D space and have that be the starting point. But they weren't, because of those extreme technological challenges that they were facing, they weren't maybe given the opportunity to start from a blank slate. Like I think Breath of the Wild, they started with a blank slate. It's like, how could we remake this completely from scratch? And I don't think that was the case with Ocarina of Time.
Yeah, that I think that's a great way to put it. Yeah, because you almost don't have the confidence or even the leeway, right? It's like, hey, we have something that works, we have something that's iconic. You know, we need to bring it all into this other world, and I think that's a probably pretty common thing for. I'm going to make a generalization that any 2D game to 3D game probably hits on its first step into that realm. Yeah. Something kind of one thing I wanted to talk about we're sort of close to it peripherally, so I'll just hijack here is a section on like the puzzles and design, right? So I think you kind of did hit on like the whole the hook shots and the what are they called? Those eye panels.
Eye switch thing.
Eye switch, yeah. It was. I often did feel, like. So I think you had a great point with the linearity of just how you traverse through things, how you traverse through dungeons or through the world. It's kind of like from one panel or switch to the next. Go here, go here, and oftentimes like the puzzles just felt contrived, like whether it was the switches like that. It's like they had a mechanic that they wanted to use and that they knew, okay, here's how you use the bow, and so we're going to place these around. There were others like it was very early, I can't remember, I think it might have been it was in the Deku tree with there's like 3 Deku shrubs, or Deku, I could be butchering that, and you have to unearth them in the right order. And then they give you some hint. Like, and they open the door and they give you a hint, and it's like, what was the point of this puzzle? Like, why did you feel the need to introduce that? Because I don't remember that being a thing before. But what was the challenge here? What was the benefit? Was it because they wanted to give a hint and they didn't know how? So they thought, hey, here's a hint on how to fight Queen Goma. How do we give this to the player? Oh, we'll make them earn it through a puzzle. Okay. So that, stuff like that just felt disjointed.
I agree.
Versus like other things where from a different tech, you find yourself in the Spirit Temple at the end, and the Spirit Temple has all of the previous dungeons puzzles in it, right? So you find yourself going and reusing them. And I actually thought that was a nice like summary of the things you've learned. While it's not original, it's like they're aware of the cohesion, right? It's like, hey, here's everything you've interacted with, and we're going to put it all together. And so I felt like that was a better example of like intentional or aware design, versus I think a lot of these analogies are like beating the player over the head of, oh, here, or just serving them something and finding a contrived way to do it. So there was a good mix of both, I felt.
I think in those cases, you unfortunately see too clearly the hand of the developer sort of entering the game and arranging things before your very eyes. that again is obscured if you're playing it in 1999. But contrived is the right word. That's basically the description of contrived, is seeing that hand come in and set things up perfectly for you. If I recall that puzzle that you're talking about, it's like a multi-stage deal, because you have to fight the one Deku first, who like gives you the hint. He's like, you have to defeat my brothers.
Yes.
In this specific order, and then you go and apply that hint to the other puzzle to give you another hint. Yeah, I mean, so you could really see them grappling with like, oh man, people are going to be so they're confused by this dungeon in 3D. How can we help them through it? And so we need to give them hints, and so they present those hints in the form of puzzles, I guess. But another way that, you know, when you play the game now, it feels dated just because they were solving an immense technical challenge at the time that doesn't exist today. You know, so those sorts of contrived puzzles aren't really needed in a game that is coming out today.
Right. Yeah. I guess because you have all those learnings of interactions from previous historical gaming, right? Or not historical, but practiced over other titles.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm wondering too, like, I don't know why I just remembered this one, but you're in the Dongo in the cavern, and you have to drop the bombs into the skeleton's eyes.
Yeah.
And that's actually something where I feel like that's something that has carried forward into games, you know, now, where you have to, you know, there's a skull and you need to do something with, you know, the holes or something, right? Whether it's filling them. And so it was obvious to me, I think, because I had played the game before, but I found myself wondering, was this an obvious puzzle, or did it say that somewhere and I just didn't read the sign or talk to the right, you know, Goron, that I missed that? Or because if it was something you had to discover, I think that's a great example of like a novel puzzle that they introduced. But now that I'm thinking about how much they had to lead the players, or thought they had to lead the players, I'm wondering, like, that was probably on a sign somewhere. Like, that's how I learned to do it the first time. I don't know if you remember that.
I think there's some environmental text given, like something about how you have to light up the eyes or something like that, and it's on you to figure out that you do that by dropping the bombs in. But so I totally wanted to talk about that.
Funny. Okay.
Because those types of, like, the way the game gates progress with those, if you'd even call them a puzzle, I'm not sure, but it's like, do the one specific thing to get the game moving forward. And I was watching this video on YouTube of this dude who played it, and I want to say that he did not play it when it came out, and so he just didn't have all of the memories of the puzzles built up in his brain, and he was furious that, I think totally justifiably so. He's like, how could you do this? There's the scene where you have to get Darunia to calm down, the Goron chief dude. And he's like, he needs to hear some kind of music, and you're supposed to remember that or somehow figure out to go all the way back to Kokiri Forest and talk to Saria and learn Saria's song, and that's like the type of music he wants to hear to get him in a good mood, and then he'll let you into the Dongo's cavern. And it's like, I just had the scene with her where it was like the tearful goodbye on the bridge, and the absolute implication of that scene is, I'm never going to see this person again. And it's very effective, I think, as a cutscene. Even now, the way that Link doesn't say anything, and he just sort of slowly backs away, and then all of a sudden turns around and runs, because he's just sort of like a child. He doesn't understand emotionally how to handle this type of like goodbye, you know?
Yeah.
Very powerful scene. Particularly so given that it's done with, like, you know, 20 polygons probably for Link's entire body. It works really well, and then it's like, go right back and talk to Saria so that you can learn this song. It's like, come on, dude. And the other thing that he mentioned is catching the fish to put in front of Jabu Jabu to get Jabu Jabu to open his mouth and suck you in. That is a perfect example of if it works where the developer is like giving you a hint and then you have the eureka moment and you go, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. You feel smart.
Hmm.
But if it doesn't work, then, and later you find out the solution or you have to look it up or something, you're like, are you kidding me?
It's just frustrating, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it just becomes a point of
Yeah.
yeah,
And it puts a lot of pressure on the developer to get that balance exactly right
absolutely.
of
Yeah,
hint. And I think that's why it's challenging to make that work well as like a core design mechanic that they keep going back to over and over, that style of puzzle.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that it's important too to like we're like drilling on this game, right? And that's the point of why we're talking today. But it's also like, I actually don't. I'm not sitting here like hating these people and these designers like you're the worst ever.
Yeah.
Um, they're operating under tons of constraints in a whole new environment. But it's just I just want to like reiterate it's an attempt to be objective, right? But it does end up having an emotional impact, and so I think it's okay to rail on them, but um,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah,
like, I'll just state, like, I love the game. I
totally.
love to play the game. I had a blast going back and playing it, but I want to try to separate my own. I mean, there's the nostalgia aspect, for sure, and I want to try to separate that from like just how does it feel to play now, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah,
And
I think exactly because that nostalgia tends with any game to paint, where you get these accolades like we have on the Wikipedia page, like greatest game of all time, and it's like, well, let's be respectful, but let's not be hyperbolic. Um, and the nostalgia definitely paints, in hyperbole. So, um, yeah.
yeah,
Anyway, that was an aside there, but uh, I like something. So what you were talking about though, before I derailed, sorry, was uh, that moment on the bridge with Saria.
mm-hmm.
Um, I'm kind of jumping ahead, I think, to what I think one of your points was just on the writing in general and kind of the
Mm-hmm.
impact that could have. Um, oh shit! I just went flat.
Oh, that's
Uh,
okay. Because I can, I have something to say about that, and feel free to jump in. But like, uh, I think that I mean the writing is really really good, and I think that happens from both the care and attention that Nintendo put into the project.
mhm.
They had, I think if you just look at the credits they gave, they and this was even the case on Link to the Past. They had someone who translated the game, and then they had someone who can read Japanese but is a native English speaker, then write the game based on that
Mm.
initial translation. And so there was just care put into the process of doing that. And it's fascinating to compare that with something like a Final Fantasy VII, which, as far as I understand, and if I'm wrong, someone listening to this, please uh, let us know. But they basically just dumped the entire text of the game into like an Excel file and gave it to the translator under an
Which is,
extreme
yeah,
deadline and had him
this
translate
even
it.
today is a common way of that translation happens. It's just out of context,
Right,
translation files. Yeah.
right. And so I think Nintendo has to be applauded for doing that, and just, but also just the writing. There's many little touches in the game in the way it's written, that do what I think really good fantasy writing does very well, which is it gives you a little tiny hint of something that
Hmm.
is much larger in the world and is because of space constraints, it's outside of the purview of the game, but it just tells you that it's there. Like I think about the after you defeat the Phantom Ganon boss,
Hmm.
and Ganon's voice comes over, and he's like, "What a useless creation this creature was! I will banish it to the gap between dimensions." And it's like, whoa, that
Yeah.
sounds super fucked up to like
Right.
put someone in the gap between dimensions. Like, what is that? What would that be like? And also, bro, like, isn't it your fault that you created the Phantom? So, like, you were the one who imbued it with all of its faculties and abilities. So, isn't it your fault that it failed? But it's just lit. so that's the kind of reaction you have to writing like that. And I think it's really effective. And
Yeah,
it's one thing that makes people continue to love the game today.
totally. And I had also done just some like, side reading and more learning and watching videos of people kind of dissecting now, that you have this historical look back at the timeline of Zeldas. And it's amazing how much, like how many avenues Ocarina of Time birthed because of the depth and nuance of writing, right? And so I don't necessarily think that was an intentional thing that they did in terms of like, hey, let's write stuff in that's going to last for 20 years. I think it was more about in taking care to write things that mattered and that were anchored to the world. It lends itself to being, an anchor for 20 years, right? So it was more of a side effect, and a good one. But stuff like that, right? You're saying like, okay, so we have this now opportunity of the dimensional part. There's the time travel part, which there, anytime I don't really ding anyone for coming up with a paradox in time travel that is kind of you have to wrestle with, as long as it's not too heavy-handed. But the whole idea of young Link and adult Link, and then closing the loop where he goes back to his time, but there's still the adult Link. And I've read theories or that's how Wind Waker was born, in this other realm, this offshoot. And so I was marveling at that, those, both the subtle moments, like you're saying, but even just kind of the larger ones that allow the world to be developed. Even the just the lore of like how the realm was created, like there were really cool moments of storytelling that weren't really directly related to anything I needed to do or to know. It was just world building, and I thought they did that really well.
Absolutely. And I think you can see that in like when they put a new trailer up for whatever new Zelda game is coming out, and you see people in the comments like freaking out over little details like, hey, they showed this. I wonder if this means that this, I wonder if that means this for Zelda's backstory. I wonder if they're hinting at, something of it. It's like, no, dude, they're just like making it up as they go along, and I want to be clear that I think Zelda doesn't have a story in the way that to compare it with a contemporary game like Final Fantasy VII has a story. I mean, Final Fantasy VII has it has something to say about the world that we live in, and it has a political point to make, and that's why the game was made, or that's sort of the intent behind the game, I think. Whereas with Ocarina of Time, the story, quote unquote, is just, I think it's just really giving context to your actions in the game. It's really just giving context to going up to an enemy and hitting B and to hit them, but because of the layers upon layers of lore that they've built up slowly over the years, that action ends up having a lot more meaning than, if it was just, if you were a block and you went up to another block and hit B. They've done a really good job of ascribing meaning to the basic core gameplay of Zelda by how well they've done the storytelling.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's that comparison is a good one of Final Fantasy VII, where you have a statement, and maybe a modern one or not, but whereas Ocarina of Time and probably most or many of the other Zeldas are more about the myth of a hero and good versus evil, and kind of more abstract, and also like very old tropes or familiar archetypes of the hero and that kind of thing. So they do very well to use those familiar patterns and then sprinkle them with really nice little bits of flavor.
Mm-hmm. And we should applaud Nintendo, I think, for how effortlessly they were doing that. And I mean, it's sort of just a tenet of Miyamoto games, I think, where it for some reason or pushing into Donkey Kong, like the idea of saving the princess as the hero was somehow revolutionary at the time. It seems incredible now to think that, but he clearly seized upon very early the importance of having some lore or story to give context to your actions, and he's just done it effortlessly ever since. And I think, around Ocarina of Time, or maybe Wind Waker or something, that's the time that he started to take a step back, and maybe his lore type details aren't as evident in modern Zelda games, but he's passed on the torch, and they continue to do that as well, I think, as they did with Zelda and then Ocarina of Time in the early stages of the series.
Yeah, I think that's something that Ocarina of Time definitely does get very heavily in its favor, is just the anchoring of lore, and just the prolific, like, not prolific, but just it was overabundant in terms of what it offered to build off of, right, and to branch off of. And I think that, like I said, I think that is something that evolved organically. I don't think that was something that was with intent, but I think the dedication to detail and the care is what made that happen. So it was intentional, but not in the way that it emerged. And I think, yeah, I would agree, Nintendo, like, that's where you start getting the hyperbole with these games, is because they have this much larger, like, you get past the mechanics and these other things, and the impact that it has is much larger because of those things. And so, yeah, I would agree. It's worth honoring. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Clearly it wasn't the focus, but it's like, well, we got to have a reason why, Ganon is this way or something. So we'll just put this in, and because Miyamoto just happens to be like a genius, it turned out that what the little detail he put in there to explain Ganon turned out to fascinate people.
Yeah. There was also, so on that kind of note, as we're giving accolades here for, their care, there were other messages and little tidbits that I found puzzling, or like, I didn't go and research, but one was the betrothal to the Zora.
Yeah.
And I remember that, and I think that persists in games, going forward. But I found myself kind of wrestling with that, and I didn't go research why that happened, but like, was that an intentional, like, hey, you're in a world and there's different cultures, and so your actions have, they have meaning, and they have consequence, and so now you're betrothed to someone because you don't understand their culture. Was that an intentional and carefully placed, what's the word I'm trying to say? Is young Link is naive. He's a child, and so now he's betrothed. He doesn't know how he got there, and then that has impacts on his adult life. Like, was that intentional? Were they trying to convey that, or were they trying to, like, give that experience, or was it just something wacky? Like the Scarecrow, where it's like, oh, this would be kind of silly. I don't know. There's just things like that in the world where it could go either way, right?
Yeah. And I think I'm inclined to say that it was almost an afterthought, or it was, the script director was writing that part and going, oh, this would be funny, something like that. But it just turned out to be just because of, I really consider the team at Nintendo that were making the first party games, especially around that time, to have been just like lightning in a bottle in terms of who was working on the project. And if you go back and look at a lot of the people who were working on those games, it's like they started at the company as programmers, or were in some technical role, or came from some totally different discipline, and they ended up like working on the script or the scenario or something, and they were just smart people who happen to realize exactly how to execute that type of thing that you're talking about, the betrothal thing, and it ends up not being a big deal and just kind of a joke. But I mean, not to get like too heady with this, but it doesn't have to resolve into anything. It's like it clearly to the Zora person, the Princess Zora, it's a big deal. But it does not have to. I mean, there's plenty of things in real life that don't resolve, and
Absolutely. Yep.
and it's fine for it to exist that way, I think, and it completely works in the context of the game. So just another example of like little detail that we'll just put in here because we feel like it, but it turns out to have been super cool.
No, I think that's a great point, and I think that's exactly right. And it's actually better that it didn't turn into anything, right? That it wasn't something you had to deal with or something to wrap, because that's how you get into this thing that modern games get into, is where, oh, we've put this in and now we have to give you resolution on every single thing, and by the end of the game you're just like, oh, fucking enough, like I don't care about all this other stuff, right? And the betrothal thing, it wasn't a cliffhanger. I didn't leave the game feeling like, oh, but what happened to I'm blanking on her name, but
Rudo, I just remembered.
Yes, like whatever happened there, like why, and also I guess the time travel part kind of takes care of it. It's like, oh, you go back to being a kid and it never happened. But there is the split of adult Link is still in that world, and so what's going on there? But I think leaving it open end is totally fine. And at those kind of that arena of where that lore does surface that way, it does very well to go without explanation. You're okay with it being open-ended, because and that gives life to the world, right? Where it's just like, yeah, that was something that happened, or you can make a fan fiction or whatever and imagine what happened there. You don't need that finality. So
as many people I'm sure have made fan fictions around Link and Princess Ruto getting married, unfortunately.
Right. Rule 34 dictates. Yeah.
Right. Dude, I thought I really liked the Link and I can't remember her name from Breath of the Wild, but the Zora lady in that game. I really liked the way that their relationship was handled, and it's another thing that just went nowhere,
Yeah.
But you're just meant to understand, like, wow, the Zora lady loves Link, and it doesn't seem like Link is interested in reciprocating, and it's just sad, and that's just the way it is. And
they actually, I remember they do it is the way it is, like, and I thought that was great too. Where it was just like, that's life, right? I mean, there's time, like, you're not always the feelings are not always mutual, and so that's a very real emotional experience. But they did handle it in that she becomes like the sage or whatever, I can't remember what they're called. Right, where it's like there's no chance. She's kind of a god in a way, where it's like she's going to help, and she'll have these feelings, but there's not really a chance for anything to come of that. So they handle it well, I think, while still injecting those moments of emotion. I also, just a random tangent, speaking of moments of emotion and like the subtleties, going to the spirit temple, and you learn about the, Gerudo, how they're being, Gerudo, right? Yeah. Imprisoned and whatnot by the two witches. Blanking on their names. It's fine. But then you learn that those are Ganon's like surrogate parents, and kind of, again, an understanding of what he grew up under. And it kind of gives like these questions of like, is he evil because these people raised him, like, was he just destined for this? And just they're nasty. These witches are nasty. And you're like, I don't know. I just felt myself like thinking about like Ganon, the child, that growing up in this barren wasteland, and it's just again, these little things that have no immediate consequence, but when you kind of expand on them, it just builds into a richer world, and it develops the characters too. Like, Ganon is evil, Link is good. but there's
Absolutely.
there's still some expansion they can have there. So
Yeah, dude. And I mean, I think both of us played the game at a super formative period in our life.
yeah.
And I mean, it's like listening to an album that you
Mhm.
loved as a teenager. And if you heard it for the first time now, you'd be like, this doesn't have any relation to me or what's going
Right.
on in my life whatsoever. But you love it because you heard it at that time. And so I think, it, if I haven't actually been that person in the YouTube comments being like, oh shit, did you see this detail, bro? Like, what does this mean for Zelda's backstory? Like, I've basically been that person, uh,
Yeah.
at certain times in my life. And it's because uh, the, these games were so good at, uh, at dropping those little details that make you just kind of dream on them.
Yeah. Totally. I don't have anything to
Um,
add to that.
Yeah, so we talked about the puzzles pretty extensively. Oh, I wanted to go back to puzzles before I
Mhm.
think we get into like final topics that we wanted to drop here. But I was trying to think about like what what constitutes a Zelda puzzle? How would I define one? And
Mhm.
I think it's one where you know vaguely what the solution is supposed to look like, and then you're presented with some environmental objects that you're supposed to move in some way to get to that solution.
Mhm.
But you don't really know what to do, and then the game will give you some hint. We were talking about the hints before, like, but it could be some environmental text, something visual in the environment, some text a character will give a hint to you with, and it it it's very different than a puzzle that we would think of traditionally, like outside of the context of Zelda. And I think about like a Rubik's cube.
Uh-huh.
That's probably like the quintessential puzzle. And a Rubik's cube, you know exactly what the solution is supposed to look like.
Mhm.
You have no idea how to get there. There's infinite, basically, choices you have for getting to the solution, and you're just sort of trying stuff, right? It's like you might turn it this way and turn it that way and then turn it this way again, and you go, oh, that got me a little bit closer to the solution. I'll keep, you know, plunging in that direction.
Right.
Or maybe you try stuff and, oh, that didn't work, so I need to step back and try something different. And the end result is just kind of over time, you're shaping your strategy. You're sort of
Mhm.
honing it, refining it, and then eventually you solve it. Although I'm not smart enough to have solved a Rubik's cube, I just thought it was a good example. But just to highlight the distinction between that and a Zelda puzzle, and Eiji Aonuma, who designed the dungeons on Ocarina, and he's like the head of the series now, has said uh, apparently that the purpose of a Zelda game is to make you feel smart.
Mhm.
Um, but I think particularly with the Ocarina of Time puzzles and also Breath of the Wild, the shrines, which are my least favorite part of the game by far. Um, it I don't I don't I guess solve them in the way that I would solve a puzzle outside of the context of the world. I feel like there's some intellectual application going on where I'm trying to think, but it's more in the sense of like I'm just trying to think what does the developer want me to do here?
Right.
It's like I'm removing myself from the game world, and it's very different than a Rubik's cube where you can't really write a strategy guide for it, and um, the purpose of it isn't to get you to feel smart; it's to actually have you be smart. If that
Yeah,
makes
right.
sense.
Yeah, no, because
Um,
you can look at the whatever. I think you could solve a Rubik's Cube in 12 moves or something once you know the optimal solution.
mhm.
But that's not, yeah, like you're saying, that's sure you can solve it, but did you actually, show any intelligence in doing that, right? Like, you're not solving anything. You're just following a path.
Right.
I think that's kind of what Ocarina of Time falls guilty of a lot. Is just like, I'm not solving anything. I'm following from A to B, and then that's supposed to make me feel smart, and it doesn't. It more often than not, it doesn't.
It
Um,
yeah, and it can if
yeah.
it just happens to strike you right. It's like the hint, the way it's written is perfect for you and your headspace at that time and what you happen to notice looking around. But I think, like I was saying before, it puts so much pressure on the developer to just nail that, and I think it's basically impossible to nail that every time. And so, at least for me, what really hammered this home for me is after I played through Ocarina, I tried to play Majora's Mask and I tried to play Wind Waker, and I just was super unengaged. And a lot of it stemmed from the puzzles. Like, I just don't enjoy, I guess at this stage in my life, or based on the type of games that I enjoy now, I don't enjoy that feeling of like just banging my head against the wall and trying things at random, because I'm like, okay, I don't get the hint. I don't see in the environment what I'm supposed to do. I don't know why this doesn't work, so I'm just sort of trying stuff until I happen to stumble into the right set of steps that solves the puzzle.
Yeah, I think, and I had that moment with this game very early on when you go to Kakariko Village and you have to, it's to get up to Death Mountain and you have to show the note to the guard. But I'd forgotten that I had the note, and so he's like, hey, piss off. And so then I'm standing there and I'm like, okay, I'm in Kakariko Village, but like, what now, right? And I think that's actually a good example of like, they didn't lead me to what to do there. Okay, here's where I need to go. There's a blocking thing. And in hindsight, I'm like, duh, you have the note. But that's actually like, I don't know if I'd call that a puzzle, but that's something. It's like there are pieces. There's a sequence of events that has to happen, and I'm moving along through them, and I have to remember with context like what I have in the world. And I think that's actually a better type of puzzle, or I would call it more of a problem than a puzzle, but that I need to solve in this game, right? And that's those kind of issues are problems or what the game does well. Even like I was trying to think about the the unlit torch. You walk in a room and there's 3 torches and one is unlit. I think that's even, I would put that in the category of like making me feel smart versus just some contrived thing, because it's like, and now if I take it a step further and say, well, why was that torch unlit, or why did the torches open the door? Like, sure, you could kind of bang on that, but I remember that feeling early on of being like, oh, this torch is out. Oh, I'm gonna light it, and then you light it and it works, and it's like, like that feels good, right? Versus kind of some of the later dungeons where, like we already discussed, it's just one panel to the next, or shooting one eye target after another, and I'm not solving anything. I don't feel smart. I know that I'm a monkey, and I know I'm supposed to push this button to get the biscuit, and so I do. And that doesn't feel good. That feels, it's tedious, right?
Dude, I have an interesting anecdote about the torch puzzle you were talking about. Yeah. I watched my sister, who doesn't play video games, do the Deku Tree or try, and she has no experience with games, so the kind of thing I was talking about before, just moving around in 3D, was a challenge. But she got into that room. It's like there's 2 torches, one is lit, one is unlit. There's a wooden stick on the ground, and the door is closed, like the door is locked, and she couldn't figure out what to do. And my sister is a smart person, she has a she works, she has a job, she's
still alive.
Right. Yeah. She remembers to put food in her mouth when she's hungry. Yeah. Like normal human stuff. But for her, she doesn't have the baked in game logic of years of stepping on switches and lighting torches and stuff like that. And so I think it's really interesting. I don't think Zelda is for everyone as much as Nintendo might have wanted it to be at the time. I think Mario is basically for everyone, and Zelda is not. And I think I almost see Breath of the Wild as like a concession to that, because the controls are really complicated, at least to me. They use every single button on the controller, and I feel like Nintendo sort of almost had like an internal strategy session where they're like, okay, from a sort of business plan perspective, Mario is going to continue to be the franchise that draws in casuals and people who don't play games that much, and we're just sort of going to abandon the idea of Zelda being for those people. And I think it's very much worked, but I think it's a concession to the fact that to enjoy a modern Zelda game and for Nintendo to even make a Zelda game that's good, you sort of have to leave the casuals behind and maybe take advantage of all that the years of built up knowledge about how puzzles and action in a Zelda style of game are supposed to work.
Yeah, I would agree. I think on one hand, I say it's an unfortunate concession because I would want to, I would love Zelda, and I think this is probably something that a lot of Zelda fans are guilty of, is I would love Zelda to be even bigger in our world, in our real world, than it is, right, in terms of cultural impact and relevance. Like I love sharing the game and the lore and the experience with people. But it almost can't get to that point for the reasons you stated, because so much of the interaction with the game world is reliant on being a video game. It's about that tribal knowledge of gaming that I built up that makes it so satisfying. And so I think you hit the nail on the head with that example with your sister. It's like, as a gamer, the torch puzzle made me feel smart. Mm-hmm. As a person, as a intelligent person, that's not going to be the case. That's going to be contrived and frustrating. Like, and there are videos like this. I can't remember. There's a guy that plays video games, has his wife play, and he just records it and he doesn't help her. I even experienced this. A friend is just now playing Breath of the Wild for the first time and got stuck on, you're supposed to cook some hot peppers to go into a cold area. And again, there's a mechanic they're trying to teach you and drive you into the next part. But she's just feeling out of touch. She's like, I haven't played games in so long, I just feel out of touch. And so there is that disconnect where it's like, well, is that a good puzzle? The question breaks into, is it a good puzzle objectively? And then the other question is it a good puzzle in the Zelda world? And those are very different questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I sort of want Nintendo to just completely abandon the idea that Zelda is for... I want everyone to enjoy it in whatever way they can, but I almost think that they make a better game when they completely leave behind the idea that Zelda is going to be for someone who doesn't play games that much anymore. And I totally don't mean that to gatekeep or say, leave the games for the gamers. No, trash opinion like that. But I feel like they're what each franchise does best. In the case of Zelda, and comparing it to Mario, what Zelda does best, it shines when it leaves behind the idea of trying to introduce mechanics in a really simple way because the vast majority of people playing the game are going to be like, I get it. Whereas with Mario, that's much more a game just in its basic mechanics and design. It's for those type of people who maybe don't play games that much, and you can just hit A and jump and sort of immediately get what you're supposed to do.
Yeah, and I think you're right exactly with that. And when you draw the line from Ocarina of Time to Breath of the Wild, you look back and the whole idea of targeting and lock on and the highlighted text, those are the things that kind of are glaring when you look back. And we're about a biased audience, reviewing this too, right? We're not the every person, like we're gamers, and so. That's who these games are for. They're for gamers, and so knowing that, I think it is the right choice to abandon those things and just move in the direction. And Breath of the Wild is a perfect example of, when you do that, look at what you get, right? Even towards the pro mode or the whatever it's called, no HUD mode. It's like it gets better and better. And so, yes, keep going in that direction. Like don't go back to the hand-holding.
Yeah, dude. Sort of on that subject. Let's rank these three games, okay? All right. Ocarina of Time, Link to the Past, and Breath of the Wild.
Okay. You just want to go, how do you want to rank, just on like gut or like
Well, let me say that if this were 1999 and we were recording this in 1999,
Yeah.
Ocarina of Time would be at the top for me. At the time I hadn't even played Link to the Past because I didn't have a Super NES.
Okay.
Growing up, I had a Genesis, so I played it later. But if I had played it and we were ranking this in 1999, I think I would still put Ocarina at the top. But now I would put Ocarina at the bottom, and I would put Breath of the Wild at the top, and I guess that would be Link to the Past in the middle. The reason for that is I think where a lot of the impact from Breath of the Wild is derived now is from the sense of scale, which is only possible because of it's sort of using. I don't know if anything on the Switch is like cutting edge technology, so whatever you'd want to call it, but or maybe it's just Nintendo. Maybe it's the modern development environment where Nintendo felt like they could farm out some of the development of the map, which I know they did to. I think it was Monolith Soft, and have both of those companies still make money on it. But whatever it is, they're using some aspect of the modern development environment to basically deliver a lot of the impact of the game. I think the impact of the game, what really affects you is when you're like jumping off of a super high tower with the paraglider, those types of things that certainly wouldn't have been possible with Ocarina of Time. Ocarina of Time, if you go back, the reason why I would have ranked it first at that time is because of, again, the technical wizardry that is on display there. And I think about like the Queen Goma boss fight. There's no better, I think, example of using 3D and using new tech to deliver impact than that fight, because it's like you hear something above you and you're forced to use the first person camera to look up and see the creepy glowing eye on the ceiling, and then it drops down on you and the fight starts. That's an amazing moment for the time.
Totally.
To play it now, obviously it feels pedestrian, right? Because so many other games have used 3D to much greater effect than that. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is, like, for Zelda, at least, when a Zelda game is very good, I think it's deriving a lot of its impact from modern technology. But that necessarily means that when a new game comes out with a new Zelda game comes out with better technology, then it's necessarily displaced by that new game. And so I'd say, in 10 years or whatever, when Nintendo decides to completely reinvent the Zelda paradigm and start from a blank slate and totally reimagine it with new tech, that game will become the best Zelda game for me, and Breath of the Wild will get pushed down.
Yeah, I can see that future where Breath of the Wild becomes the Ocarina of Time of today, where you can respect it for all it did and the way it advanced the world, and it, yeah, I kind of paused because I wondered, and I won't go into it now, but I wondered, does Breath of the Wild create the seeds of lore like Ocarina of Time did? And we won't know that until 10 years go by, and I'm sure we could go and evaluate it now just to see if those seeds are there. But I would agree that and that's kind of what you want from a game series anyway, is that the technologically advanced version of it a decade later brings everything from the past into a future light that makes it even better and retells stories or tells them in new ways. But even as I say that, I do see Breath of the Wild as the game that kicks Ocarina of Time off of the pedestal, right, and replaces it. And I would agree in the ranking. First of all, Breath of the Wild is at the top with Ocarina of Time, and then with Link to the Past in the middle and Ocarina of Time at the bottom. But I find that ranking interesting because when the next one, whatever that is, comes, where will Link to the Past go? Will Link to the Past stay where it is because of, is it protected because of the 2D nature and the stylization and all these things that it has kind of in its favor, or will it be pushed down a rank? That's kind of the thing that I wonder about.
I think it has. I think it could have some helium, and later be elevated to being the best. I don't know, because eventually Breath of the Wild is going to feel pedestrian, I think, because other games are going to do 3D exploration so much better. I mean, it's not like it was even the first to do that. I mean, and that's obvious, but I think what it did so well is it has an enormous world, which many other games have. But when I sample some of those other open world games, they just feel like the developers made a whole bunch of stuff and dropped it into a big world and didn't really think about how those things interact. Whereas in Breath of the Wild, everything feels super purposeful, meaningful. So it's sort of like a curated, like open world type of exploration,
Absolutely.
which is different than some other games, which I won't say mean things about by naming them. But I think in the case of Link to the Past, it's like it's a mechanics game. It's sort of almost like a hardcore action game, and there's definitely been a renaissance with those types of games as of in the last 10 years or so. And I mean, and it's a classic Tezuka game, like kind of like I was talking about before. So I think those mechanics never go away, and they're never eclipsed. If a game is mechanically very good and feels tight and feels, like there's some friction and how you're moving around the world and encountering the enemies, that doesn't change. And I think that's why Super Mario Brothers 3, Super Mario World are still justifiably so beloved. And so I guess to sum up, it's like if you're making so much of your game's impact derived from technology or the newness of it, then it must be eclipsed by new technology that comes later down the line. And there's nothing wrong with that, because you're still delivering something that's so impactful because it feels so new and fresh. You just have to accept that it will be eclipsed. Whereas with something like a Super Mario World or Mario 3, it's never really going to be eclipsed until someone does mechanics and just sort of like the feeling of moving in the world, the feeling of how Mario moves in midair and skids on platforms, and the unbelievable level design in those games. That's probably never going to be eclipsed because those games are coming up on 30 years old. So I think that's the choice you have to make as a developer, is like, is my fun going to be derived from the tech? Perfectly valid choice. Or is it going to be derived from the mechanics? Also perfectly valid choice. And I'm not a developer, and I never will be, so I sort of don't know what I'm talking about, but that's what struck me.
No, but I think that's actually really insightful what you're saying there. Is, I think about why these games haven't been dethroned. I think that's exactly it. Is they excel at what they're delivering, which, I mean, I guess that's like a duh statement. But other games that come along, it's like they can't do it better, right? And maybe they derive a component, you get things like Super Meat Boy or whatever, where it's like, yeah, we take the platform elements and we punish you. But in terms of delivering, level design and, the physics-based, like you're talking about, the different movement and the tightness of control, Mario's there for a reason, and it will continue to be there. Versus Ocarina of Time, they're fitting a lot of the game into the shape of technology of the time. And so you can look at it and you say, this is like a greatest game of its time. Like, that's something that I'm comfortable saying. Like, yes, it was the greatest game of its time. So, you go back to 99 and absolutely. Is it the greatest game of all time or the greatest Zelda of all time? No, it's neither. And I guess I would, now looking back at, these points on this timeline, I would hope then that Breath of the Wild is not the greatest game of all time. Like, it is definitely for me the greatest Zelda of all time presently, but that is not a label that I would affix to it permanently, knowing what I know now. And I would hope to not affix, I hope the one that's comes is better. We all do. Like, you always want the next one to be better, but I guess just giving it that temporal nature instead of a permanent fixture is a more comfortable way to label it.
Yeah, because it's what we've come to expect, right? It's like someday a new Zelda game will come out and it'll be unbelievable in a way that Breath of the Wild never could have been. But I don't see. I don't know. Do you like Super Mario 3 more, or do you like Super Mario World more?
I think this often boils down to when you started playing them or which one you started with, and for me it was World. So that's the one for me. That's the top. But I understand that that's a contentious statement to make.
Yeah, it's so hard to choose, but I mean, both of those games I think will never be dethroned because they're just mechanically so fun, and visually they are so confident, and we're sort of using the technology. I mean, it's like I guess they're using the tech in a way that wasn't designed to blow you away. I mean, I didn't play them at the time, so I shouldn't really say, but I again, because I didn't have an NES or a Super NES, I played them like later on, but they're not relying on the tech. In my view, they're relying on the mechanics, and that's why they're still so good, and that's why no other Mario games, I feel like Mario 64, which I am also only playing as an adult, is very, very good because I think it gets the mechanics so right. But that's another conversation. I think we've pretty much agreed that Ocarina of Time is a remarkable technical achievement, and it's fun to play today, at least for me, because I know exactly what to do, and I'm just sort of blowing through the game. And if you're watching me play it like my son does, I think for him it just looks like a movie or something.
Yeah. And it's a critical, I would argue maybe the most critical building block of the Zelda universe and kind of like lore and
Totally. Yeah. And it basically served as a template for, I don't know how many 3D Zelda games came out between Ocarina and Breath of the Wild, but 3 or 4?
Yeah, 3. Yeah. You had Twilight Princess and Majora's Mask. I don't know if you consider that its own. Wind Waker.
Skyward Sword,
right? So 4.
Yeah. And tons, dude, you could be sure that tons of people played each one of those games when they were 14 years old, and it's the best game they ever played, and it blew their mind. So it did establish a template for many successful games, at least from the perspective of selling units. Yeah.
Yeah, and also just anchoring, to the next generation like that. And that's what a brand, but also a myth is all about, right? Is that you tell it and retell it in ways that attach to the next person, and just kind of build that. I don't want to say user base. Mechanically, it's the user base, but then also just the myth in the world, right? Build its permanence to over time. So, yeah, incredibly successful.
Yeah, I think that does it. I think we sort of hit on all the points we wanted to talk about. Not a greatest review. Game. Yeah, this is, if you're listening, this is the best ever review you're going to hear of Ocarina of Time. We've pronounced definitively it's not a greatest game of all time. So go ahead and, if you have access, update that Wikipedia page and delete that phrase about it being one of the best games of all time. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I'm going to remove it right now.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, appreciate that. All right. So this was our first episode. If you liked it, please feel free to, what am I supposed to say at the end? Like, please rate it and leave us a review if you enjoyed it. And maybe we can be back with another one. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Thanks.